I just want to take a minute to have a look at the flow of the data that we're working with. So let's have a look at what we got so far. So far we have our database import. We have our .csv file, which is then turning into a star info array. Now what are we going to do with that star info array? Let's just imagine for a second that what we're trying to do is we're trying to get an array of positions and somehow feed them into Unity, so Unity says, oh, I know what to do with that, I'll render a point for each of them. A point for each of them, that sounds a lot like a particle system, and it is. The thing is that we're going to end up doing some very specific and platform like consideration sort of stuff. Like we're going to end up really wanting to be much closer up to the metal than what the Unity's built-in particle system is going to easily give us. So we're going to kind of create our own, essentially our own particle system with our own shader and our own way of generating a mesh based on each point in the star info array. So because of that, we're going to create a mesh, and then with that mesh, which will have a point for each position of the stars, we're then going to create a prefab, which will contain the mesh. The prefab will also have its own shader that will know how to render a point for each of the stars. And yeah, so that's the workflow. The reason why these two are going to be, these are going to be assets. The reason why they're going to be assets and not just rendered in play mode is we want to be very explicit to Unity and saying, no, I want you to save these files to the disk and they're always going to live in storage rather than kind of on RAM or loaded when you press play or something like that. Because we're working with so much data and we're creating these meshes procedurally, we want to do it right. We want to create assets in the assets folder, which are going to exist when we close the program. They're going to be there. You know, we could drag them into another Unity program very easily. So let's have a look at what this. I'm going to create a UML diagram for this assets creation system. Remember, we start off with what we've already got. We've got our star database loader, which has our array of star info. Okay. All right, so that's the information that's coming in. What we want to do now is we want to create a mesh asset for that star info array. So we're going to have a base asset generator, very similar to our database loader, asset generator, which will have a single function called generate. And again, just like our database loader, we're going to have an asset generator inspector, so that we'll be able to press that generate button. So we'll just call it AG inspector. Okay. And our star mesh generator, the class that's going to create a mesh from this list of star info objects, that's going to be a asset generator. It's going to inherit from asset generator. So we've got a star mesh generator. It's also going to have access to this array of star info. And from that, from that star info, it's going to create a mesh asset. Now the interesting thing is, this is not really going to, once it creates that mesh assets, it's going to save it to the assets folder, and then it doesn't know about it. So we're going to have, eventually we're going to have a prefab generator. We'll just call it a mesh prefab generator. Now it's going to know, it's going to be an asset generator as well. It's going to know where this mesh file is, and it's going to create a prefab which has that mesh inside it. So it's going to know about where the star mesh generator is going to save the mesh, and then it's going to create a prefab. Okay, that's pretty much everything. Now we will also need to create an asset utility class. Asset utility. That's going to help us to delete assets, to save assets, and just do a few little functions with assets. All right, so next up we're going to create this star mesh generator and create our meshes. So once again, before we start, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. If we go ahead and jump into our assets folder and our scripts, we have these database loaders. We're going to eventually be creating quite a few folders. So I'm going to put these in their own folder. Keep things nice and neat. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to rename our scriptable objects folder. That's a bit ambiguous. So I'm just going to call that procedural assets, which really means that we're using code to generate all the information that's stored inside that folder. All right, now with that, we can go ahead and start coding. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder in our scripts, and this is going to be called our asset generators. Now in this video, we're really going to be creating the meshes, but we'll also be creating a lot of the framework for stuff we'll be using later down the road. So I'm going to create our asset generator file. Wait, sorry, before I do this is going to bug me. A bit of a what do you call it? OCD. Asset dash generators. Folders have the dashes and scripts don't. That's how I sort of think about it. Asset generator .cs. Okay, so this is going to be our static. Oh, it's not a static. Our abstract class. It's going to use Unity engine. Yes, it is, because it's going to inherit from scriptable object, and it's going to be public abstract class asset generator. All right. Now, so each of these asset generators is going to, we're going to have a generate button, and when we press that, it's going to, wherever we have our folder, we'll have our folder path, wherever this folder path points to, we're going to delete everything inside that folder, and we're going to put our own assets inside it. So I'm going to make that public. We're going to have a public void generate. And we're also going to have a protected abstract void. Abstract meaning that anyone who inherits from this asset generator class needs to implement this function. And this is going to be called generate assets. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to call generate assets. But before we do, for every class that implements this system, we're going to delete any assets that are already in this folder path. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create an assets utility, and that assets utility is going to delete all the assets in this folder. So I'll just leave a little comment here: delete assets first. Okay, go into utilities. Create our asset utility .cs. It's going to be a public static class asset utility. It's going to use Unity engine as well as Unity editor. And we're going to have a function in this class. It's going to be called clear asset path, or clear asset folder. So it's going to be public static void clear asset folder. It's going to pass in a string, which will be our asset our folder path. Now, how do we do this in Unity? What do we got to do? Well, first of all, we've got to look in that folder path. We've got to get all the assets in that folder. we're gonna delete all of them. So how we're gonna do that is there's an asset database dot find assets, and what that's gonna do is that's gonna return a list of GUIDs. GUIDs is like unique ID for each asset, and from that we can get the paths. So let's have a look at how we can do that. This will be another static function, public static void get asset paths string folder path. Okay, so now we say return asset. Oh, we're going to be using a bit of link here. System.link. Okay, we're going to return asset database dot find assets. This is where we could pass in a filter if we wanted to only have assets that have awesome in the name or something like that. But we're gonna want every file that's in this asset path. And it also, you'll notice that it expects an array, even though we're only searching in one folder. That's okay. So what we can do is we can create a new array, and it's just going to be an array with one element in it. Okay, so now we've got, that's returning a list of, it's returning a list of GUIDs. GUIDs will be returned, and from those GUIDs we can then create our we can then find our asset paths rather. So let's say we go assets, and then we go select GUID asset database .GUID to asset path and GUID. So what we're doing is we're saying get the GUIDs, and then turn those GUIDs into paths. We're also going to turn that into an array, and we'll make sure we're returning a string array. All right, beautiful. Now that we have now we can say get asset paths with our folder name. Now for each of them, we want to delete it, and this is where link would work. So we could do, like, if we wanted to be really simple, we could just say toList for each. But I think it is worth to know how to do an extension method, and just to make our lives a little bit easier, we'll probably use it down the track with a few other things as well. So I'm going to quickly create an extension method for our enumerators, which will allow us to say, let's see, I'll just do a little pseudocode for each path delete asset. Okay, so let's just have a look at how we're going to do that extension method. I'm going to open up a new utility class. I'm just going to call it extension methods.cs. Public, it's going to be public static class extension methods, and this is going to using system.collections.generic. Okay, so if you haven't seen this before, it's kind of a little bit weird syntax, but it means it'll work for every array, for every list, for every enumerable, IEnumerable. Okay, so let's have a look at what this looks like. So we say public static void for each. For each, this is what we call a generic function. I'm not really going to go into what exactly that means, but it kind of means it's like a really flexible function. It'll work for lots of different types. Okay, this IEnumerable of type T source, and what we're going to pass in we're going to pass in an action of the same type, and we're just going to say for each var t element, var element in source action element. So really we're just encompassing this into a way that's going to be more readable for when we're using lots of link queries, etc. So So when we go to our asset utility, you notice now, so get asset pass is returning an array, and now we can say dot for each. And so for each for each path, for each path, we're going to pass in a function, and the function is going to it's going to be asset database dot destroy. Delete asset? No, what's that? Wait, I'll just check my notes here. Yeah, delete asset. Yeah, that's right. Asset database dot delete asset, and we'll pass in the path. Look at that. Okay, how's that looking? I think this is okay. I think this is just a bit of a confused compiler, a bit of a confused checker. I think it's okay. If I restart the program, it should be all right. All right. Yeah, that was it. It was just figuring out what it was working with. Okay. So now that we're able to clear our asset folder, I'm going to go ahead and go back into my asset generator. We'll say asset utility. Where's my IntelliSense? Asset utility. What's going on here? It's public static class, asset utility. Okay, there it is. I think it was just loading. Asset utility dot clear asset folder path. I really should call it, oh yeah, that'll be fine. Clear asset folder, okay. Asset utility, clear asset folder. And then once we've done that, we're able to generate our assets. Now we're going to go ahead and create our mesh asset generator. Or in fact, before we do that, I should really create the inspector button. So the asset generator inspector. So I'm just going to, in our asset generators folder, I'm going to create a new folder called editor. That's a special name. It always has to be editor. And then we're going to create a new class, and it's going to be called asset generator inspector.cs. Okay, and this is going to be very similar to our database loader inspector. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and open up our database loader inspector and just do a lot of reading and kind of copying. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with the red squigglies, but that's all right. We'll go on regardless. Using Unity Engine as well as Unity Editor. We're going to have a custom inspector. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to copy and paste this. It's almost identical except for database loader. We're going to call asset generator. And then we're going to maybe rename that DL to AG, and instead of load database, it's going to be called generate asset. Just generate. Okay. Yeah, no, the red squigglies are going crazy, but that's okay. One little trick I have found out of interest, if you're like, because I find that it is worth working with, even though you do get this happen sometimes, it's still worth dealing with this to be able to use Visual Studio Code, just because it's so much lighter, and you get really used to your code editor. So when this sort of stuff does happen, I find if I reopen Visual Studio, the full IDE, it kind of fixes up a few things. So I'm going to go ahead and go in my scripts. I'm just going to open any script, and I'm hoping what that's going to do is that's going to fix up our IntelliSense. Okay, so let's see if that worked. Go back, open up our. All right, so that's yeah. See, that seems to fix it up. Now, what are we up to? We've created our asset generator inspector. Oh, there's something I've forgotten. Our asset generator inherits from scriptable objects. Scriptable objects. Okay. Asset generator inspector. That should fix that up. Okay, and now we're gonna finally start creating our mesh generator. So I'm gonna go into asset generators, create a new class, call it mesh generator.cs. Star mesh generator. We will be using Unity engine as well as link. This will be a public class. Star mesh generator. Inherit from asset generator, which will mean that we'll need to implement our protected override function called generate assets. Okay, so we've got the bare bones here. Now, what are we doing? We're getting, if we remember, we're getting our stars. We're then converting those stars into a mesh, and then we're saving that asset. So let's have a look. We got our star database loader. This is really what we'll be working with. We're gonna have a reference to this database loader so that we can get its stars that it stores. So let's go ahead and have a reference. We'll say public star database loader. We'll just call it database. And with those stars, we're going to create a mesh. So we'll have a void create mesh. Oh, so it's not going to be void. It's going to be it's going to return that mesh. Create mesh. And we're going to need those stars, so we'll say star info array stars, as well as we'll want to give it a name. So we'll have a string, give it a name. Okay. So if that's making sense, we're going to have our database. We're then gonna var mesh equals create mesh. We're going to pass in the database stars. And we're also going to have a name. I'll just call it stars for now. Stars. I'm trying to remember. Do I need to have stars or stars.mesh? I think it might need to be. No. That's when it gets saved. Yeah, the mesh name is just going to be stars. Okay. Okay. So we have our stars. We have our name. Now we can go ahead and create a new mesh. So we say var mesh equals new mesh. Mesh.name equals name. Mesh.vertices equals stars dot select s dot position. So a vertex for each star's position dot to array. Okay, we're going to do something a little interesting here because we're working with a point topology of the mesh. If you've ever worked with triangles in mesh generation, throw all that out the window. It's a very different way of looking at it. It says there's like an index for each point, and then we're gonna assign that. It looks a little strange. It's just how Unity does this. So we'll say an array of integers, indices. And really, all we need is a list for going from 0 to however many vertices there are. So how we can do this is just go stars dot select. Now, if we in our select function, usually we just say select. This is saying for each star. But what we want to know now is we want to know for each star and its index in that array. So how we can do this is we go si. If we have two parameters in our select function, that I there is going to be our index of the star. So, for 0, 1, 2, 3, for however many stars there are. And all we're going to do is we're going to return that index and convert that to an array. And now we can say mesh.set indices, and we're going to pass in those indices. And we're also going to need to set the mesh topology. Mesh topology dot, so we could have, like, for example, a lines, maybe a line render or something like that would have lines, or a line strip. which is like a row of lines. Yeah, anyway, we're just going to use points. And don't worry about this submesh idea that, yeah, we're just using our submesh. Indices does exist. Indices, okay. All right, return mesh. Okay, so now we have our mesh. All we need to do is save it. And we're going to go back into our asset utility and create a new function for saving assets. It's saving mesh assets specifically. All right. So we have a public static void save mesh asset. We'll need the folder path, and we'll need the mesh. All right. Now we're going to say we're going to need to create the full path of the mesh, which is a string asset path equals folder path plus a / plus the mesh dot name plus a dot mesh. All right, now we just say asset database dot create assets mesh and asset path. All right, so we've got our save mesh asset function. We can now, with our mesh, we can say asset utility dot save mesh asset folder path and mesh. That folder path came from our parent asset generator variable. And the last thing we've got to do, because remember this is a scriptable object, is we need to create an asset menu. I'm trying to remember what I want to keep things nice and consistent. So our star database, it will look something like this. Our asset menu, might as well just copy and paste. Starchart would say asset generators star mesh. That'll do for now. All right. So, where are we? Let's just take a moment to have a look at what we got so far. If we have a look at our procedural assets folder, oh, you can't really see that. One moment. Have our procedural assets folder. We have our star database loader. I'll just call that star database loader. I'm also going to create another scriptable object, which will be our mesh generator, star mesh generator. All right, and now, so we've got our database loader. If we have a look at our stars, they're not in there because we lost them when we closed the program. So now we've got our stars because we've hit that load database button. And in our mesh generator, we're going to need to specify what folder we want this mesh to be put in. I'm going to make things a little bit neat. So I'm just going to have a meshes folder. And let's see if I can drag that. No, I can't drag that in. But I can right click on meshes and copy its path and paste that into folder path. And I will also need to drag this database loader into the database that we're referencing. So in other words, our database loader is getting all those star info objects, and then our mesh generator knows about this database loader and is able to import those objects. So now it's still called load data. Remember this is the danger of copying and pasting. I'd still do it, but you just get into trouble. See how it says load database? It really should be called generate. This is our asset generator. Oh yeah, what does it generate? Okay. All right, so that really should say generate because it works differently. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and press generate. And if we have a look inside our meshes folder, we have our new mesh, which you can't really see. I'm going to see if I can make this bigger, but it's kind of like, yeah, we've got points in here. I don't know if that's going to show up on the video. You can just see the points. We can have a look at the data. Like, for example, it says nine vertices, 9 triangles, so it's all in there. What we're going to need to do next is create a prefab from that mesh, and also we're going to create a material that'll know how to generate a quad for each star.